It looks like you have a bigger delay than
All right. Yep. Okay. So moving
you want
along.
me to do it? It might work faster if I do it.
Well, I think I just have to anticipate. That's
Okay,
all.
cool.
So I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to work on a couple of cover crop projects over the last couple of years in collaboration with folks like Joel Love, Patrick Troy, Danielle Treadwell, and Jose Perez. And so some of what I'm going to show here today has been with their input. We've also had funding for cover crop work in the Swanee Valley region of North Florida from Southern SARE and several other organizations. So the focus of this presentation will be on cover crops in an annual rotation with common row crops. And so I'm going to briefly review some economic methods for evaluating cover crops. We'll look at a couple national studies of cover crop economics. I'll introduce a couple cover crop budgets that we've put together, as well as some perceived benefits and barriers to cover cropping reported by farmers in North Florida. And I think, I'll try to wrap up with some conclusions. One of those I think that you've been hearing over and over is that there's a lot of variation in the way cover cropping can be done. And that creates a lot of variation in the economics where you see, some scenarios where farmers seem to be doing well with the economics, but in other cases they're not. So, it's not really a silver bullet necessarily. All right, again, just for the context, so I'm based in the Swanee Valley region of North Florida, and some of the common rotations we see here are corn peanut rotations and cotton peanut rotations. And so then, those cash crops are in the ground for somewhere between 4 and 6 months. And then the remainder of the year, oftentimes there's either a fairly long fallow period or a cover crop. In some cases, farmers do have the opportunity to do like a winter cash crop as well. I'd also like to mention, folks like David Wright have done a lot of work on multi-year grass-based rotations here in Florida, showing significant benefits from those systems. But my focus today is really on the annual cash row crops with cover crops in between for part of the year. So, what are some of the possible financial costs and benefits for a farm from cover cropping? I'm waiting for the slide.
Yeah, try it again. I heard you click and didn't see it change. I don't know what's going on here. All right, I'm going to take over. I'm taking control.
Okay, got it.
Let's just do it that way.
Sounds good. So certainly when you're putting in a cover crop, you're going to have some cover crop input costs. Those, of course, include the cost of seeds. Maybe if you're adding fertilizer, could include the cost of fertilizer or herbicides as well. And then you have the equipment operation, right? And for planting, for managing, for terminating, sometimes even for prepping the ground prior to planting, if you're in a tillage broadcast system. And those equipment operating costs include the machine labor, they include fuel, and they include an allocation for fuel on that equipment as well. If you need to purchase new equipment to work within your cover cropping system, you'll have those added costs as well for equipment ownership. And economists like to keep in mind that there may be opportunity costs, which are foregone benefits of using land, labor, and capital for cover cropping if there would be an alternative that would have some benefit. On the benefit side of the equation for cover cropping, one common benefit that's mentioned is the possibility of increased cash crop yields and the sales revenue from that increased yield. But in other cases, maybe the average or expected yield might not be expected to be any higher with a cover cropping system, but you might get more stability, less variation, less chance of a really bad crop year when you're using a more resilient system that could include cover cropping. And then we're also hearing that a lot of farmers are reporting reduced cash crop costs when they move to a cover crop system, especially if it's a low till or no till system. They may avoid, they may have less chemical costs, they may have less tillage costs and things like that in a cover cropping system. Also, if you're grazing the cover crop, there is likely going to be income from, the animal weight gain or feed savings. And then of course, cost share was mentioned, that there are cost share programs available now. And so that would certainly be a benefit as well. And we'll move to the next slide. In terms of methods, how do we go about evaluating whether a cover crop really is financially worthwhile for a farm or not? There are really two main methods. One is called partial budgeting on an annual basis. And then the other is a multi-year investment analysis. And then finally, we could also do some form of risk analysis that measures the volatility of returns over time. Of course, there are also non-financial factors that may influence farmer decision-making, but my focus here will be on the financial side of things. So, thanks. All right, just a quick review of kind of the main methods that we use. The first one is partial budgeting. So we take a standard enterprise budget, which many of you I'm sure have seen before. When we do partial budgeting, we're really only focused on changes in a budget. We're not trying to capture the whole budget in two different scenarios. We're just looking at those things that change from one scenario to the other. So we're going to look at additional costs or reduced costs from a cover cropping system compared to the alternative without cover cropping. And we're going to look for additional revenues and sources of reduced revenues in a cover cropping system compared to the alternative without cover cropping. And that's done in this case on an annual cost and revenue basis. Next slide. But we often hear that farms transitioning to cover crops won't see the full benefit the first year, and we'll see variation from year to year. So a one-year snapshot doesn't really give the full picture. So in those cases, when we're really trying to examine uneven costs and returns over multiple years, we would go to what we call an investment analysis. This type of analysis can also be done for investing in new equipment, starting up a new enterprise, as well as starting a new farming system like cover cropping. And with this analysis, essentially what we're doing is we're looking at the initial upfront costs. Those might be purchasing some different equipment, a no-till drill or roller crimper, things like that. And then it sums the annual net cash flows in following years and subsequent years. Again, though, the trick, like with partial budgeting, is kind of this idea of what do we attribute to the change from the cover cropping and what do we leave out, right? And so that's really one of the key things in doing any type of economic analysis of cover cropping, is this with and without principle. How do we isolate what occurs with versus without the cover crop? And so just wrapping up the idea of this investment analysis. So, you might have that initial cost of the investment. Maybe you have some negative net cash flow impacts in the first couple of years after the cover crop as you're adapting to this new system. But then the idea is then farther along in the future, you'll start seeing more and more benefits of adopting a new system like that. And the question with investment analysis is, do those future benefits, especially when we discount them, and that's another topic, but when we discount those future benefits, do they end up outweighing the initial costs? All right, moving along. And so net present value is kind of the preferred method that economists use. And with that equation, if the net present value of that is positive, then it's a worthwhile investment. It's better than the opportunity cost of alternative investments. All right, so now I'd like to focus on some studies that have been done on the economics of cover cropping. The first one is this study from Iowa just a couple years back. They surveyed 233 Iowa farmers who planted corn or soybeans following a cover crop, and who also had corn or soybean fields that did not follow a cover crop. So they kind of boiled it down to the farmers that were able to compare both scenarios on their farms. They compared the costs, yields, and revenues on the fields with the cover crop and the fields that did not have cover crop. And you'll see that although some of the farmers in their survey did have better yields with cover crops, others had lower yields. And the figures in this chart show average net returns across all the farmers surveyed. And you'll see that on average, the corn yield following cover was actually a little bit lower than corn yield without the cover crop. And this was, again, a one-year snapshot for 2016 with cereal rye preceding corn as the predominant rotation. So, you know, they did look at variation depending on method of planting and termination and tillage and years of experience. And again, this is Iowa, you know, it's not necessarily the Southeast, but it's a pretty big sample. They found consistently slightly negative returns for farmers unless the cover crops were grazed, unless they had livestock grazing on the cover crops, that improved the return. Or of course, if they had cost share, or in some cases were harvesting and selling cover crop biomass. Now looking at their results without any cost share, even grazed cover crop, the grazed cover crop cereal rye on average showed a little bit of a negative return. So now that study did not consider multi-year impacts or public conservation benefits. And it kind of really showed that the cost share is still critical in a lot of cases. And these Iowa authors concluded that, at least in their state, the necessary conditions to expand cover cropping are currently missing. All right, next slide, please. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the National Cover Crop Survey that's done every year. Looking at the results from the most recent survey can help us in thinking about the economics as well. So this is a broad national survey, and the most recent results are that on average in that survey, corn and soybean growers did actually see a little bit of a better yield following cover crops than without. But actually slightly lower yields on average for cotton, which then might be more appropriate for some of us down here in the Southeast. About 40 to 50% of corn and soybean farmers reported better weed control, reduced herbicide costs, or reduced fertilizer costs following cover crops. For cotton, 71% of growers reported reduced herbicide cost, and 53% reported reduced fertilizer costs. So although, according to this survey, although cotton growers may not be getting better yields with cover cropping, they are seeing reductions in some of their input costs. Next slide. SARE also did some economic analysis recently of cover cropping. Some of their data actually comes from the National Cover Crop Survey. And instead of using just a one-year snapshot, they estimated costs and returns for the first year for farmers that are in their first year after cover cropping, as well as fields that have been cover cropped for 3 consecutive years and 5 consecutive years. And so what you see based on their analysis is that, yes, in a lot of cases that you're not going to see a return in the first year, but after 3 or 5 years, you're much more likely to see a positive financial return from cover cropping. Looking at the top row, they kind of came up with their estimates based on a normal weather year. And then I think one thing that was really interesting about their analysis is they really honed in on different scenarios, different situations in which cover cropping would pay off more quickly, right? And I think one of the take-home messages from this IST is that, choosing the right cover crop has a lot to do with the particular problem or situation you're addressing and your goal for cover cropping. Looking at the largest impacts or the most beneficial scenarios are in the bottom of this table. I'll start at the bottom of the chart. And that's in a drought year, as that also came up in like Mike Mulvaney's talk. 2012 was a drought year, and in a drought year, their conclusion is that oftentimes a cover crop will pay for itself and show a positive return even in the first year. Also with grazing income, often cover crops can be financially worthwhile in the first year. And you also get quicker benefits from cover cropping when you have severe herbicide resistant weed problems that you're addressing, when you're using cover crops in conversion to no-till, when you're addressing soil compaction, and when you have extra fertilizer savings using legumes. Those are all examples of scenarios where cover cropping is likely to pay off more quickly. All right. So now, I feel like we haven't done a lot of work, at least from I know some other folks have done some work on the economics, maybe in grazing scenarios or long-term multi-year rotations, but I haven't seen much work. We've been trying to remedy that on kind of these short-term annual cash crop rotations like we see in Florida. Next slide. So one thing we did in 2018, we had a field day. We surveyed 17 growers, or 17 growers responded to a survey at that field day. The majority of them were very interested in both winter and summer cover crops, as well as grazing cover crops. We asked them about the primary benefits that they thought they could gain from using cover crops. And the top two responses were nutrient management and water or moisture management. Now, a lot of the folks at this field day were not, some of them were actively cover cropping, others were not. And so their perception, may or may not have been grounded in experience. Other recent interviews we've done, or that some of my colleagues have done, have revealed perceived benefits in terms of nematode control and more widespread emphasis than shown here on weed management and erosion control among North Florida farmers. The primary benefits perceived at this particular field day were the equipment that's needed for cover cropping and the annual cash costs of cover cropping. Other notable barriers in interviews with farmers are the labor needed for cover cropping, the timing in relation to cash crops, and a lack of knowledge about cover crops. Next slide, please. All right, so with assistance from folks like Joel Love and a few farmers and some other folks, we put together some sample cover crop budgets for North Florida. These show annual costs per acre and assume a row crop rotation without grazing. Now, you've seen a couple other cost estimates so far in the IST, and everyone's going to be a little bit different. That's totally normal. Every budget is based on different assumptions and estimates. For example, I think Kip put up a budget showing cereal rye costs totaling about $60 per acre. Here, based on the assumptions we made for cereal rye, we came out a little bit higher at $85 per acre. Some of the differences there were we assumed irrigation was used to help establish the cereal rye. Also, I think our seed costs were a little bit higher. I'm not sure if that came out primarily because of the cost quotes that we got for seed, or maybe we're using a little bit of a higher seeding rate. And it's possible that, because I'm an economist, I like to add in things like interest on operating expenses as well, which bumps up the cost a little bit. Anyway, looking at these four different options for a winter or cool season, we did cereal rye or oats, radish, and winter pea blend. And then for a summer or warm season cover crop, we looked at sun hemp alone or in a blend of sun hemp, pearl millet, and cowpea. All of our costs, for all 4 of those, the costs ranged from about $70 per acre up to about $85 per acre for operating expenses. Now, those examples did not include additional ownership costs, like the 3 scenarios on the right. We assumed a no-till drill, but we did not add in the equipment ownership cost of that in the analysis. Looking at quotes we got recently, $40,000 for a 15-foot no-till drill, $7,000 for a 15-foot roller crimper. When you depreciate that and then spread it out over the acreage that the machine is assumed to be used, we end up with adding about $10 per acre per year in costs for that. All right, next slide, please. So, again, wrapping up my presentation, definitely I think it'd be great to be able to do more work on the economics of cover cropping in the Southeast. But ideally, every farmer is going to be different. So ideally they want to be able to do their own analysis. And this slide shows some websites with tools that could help with that. Next slide, please. All right, so just wrapping up, kind of in conclusion, it appears that cover cropping does pay off financially for some farmers, but not all, right? Not others. It depends a lot on the farmer's individual situation and how many years they've been cover cropping. I would like to see more research on the financial feasibility of cover crop systems for different rotations and purposes in the southern region. Ideally, as extension agents, we can work with farmers to help them evaluate cover crops, choose the most appropriate systems for them, and help them evaluate the financial impact of cover cropping. And then finally, it does appear that cost share is an important incentive to increase cover crop adoption in the Southeast. And that's it. Appreciate you all listening. And I don't know if we take questions in the chat or what.